April 12, 1945. The rolling hills of central Germany stretched endlessly before the advancing American forces, every tree line a potential death trap, every farmhouse a possible stronghold. The morning mist clung to the valleys like torn fabric, refusing to surrender to the weak sunlight that filtered through the overcast sky. Private First Class James H. Carter crouched in a muddy foxhole, his Springfield rifle trembling slightly in hands that had seen too much already, calloused from months of gripping wood and steel, scarred from barbed wire and rough terrain. Around him, the men of Easy Company believed they understood how this day would unfold. A cautious advance, suppressing fire from a distance, and perhaps by nightfall, another village liberated, another objective secured, another small step toward ending this seemingly endless conflict. They believed courage meant staying together, following orders, maintaining the line that separated chaos from control. They had no idea that before the sun set, one man they had doubted, one soldier they had dismissed with whispered slurs and sidelong glances, one private whose skin color had marked him as different in the eyes of too many, would rewrite everything they thought they knew about valor, about sacrifice, about what it truly means to stand up when every rational calculation suggests you should stay down. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how a moment of betrayal became a testament to extraordinary heroism, how the loneliest hours of one man's life would echo through military history for generations to come, and how a single act of courage would force an entire company, an entire regiment, perhaps an entire nation to confront the gap between the values they professed and the reality they practiced. The morning had started like so many others during the final push into Germany during the waning days of the conflict in Europe. The 471st Infantry Regiment had been advancing steadily for 3 weeks, meeting pockets of resistance that ranged from token to ferocious, from hastily abandoned positions to carefully prepared defensive works manned by soldiers who understood the conflict was lost, but fought anyway out of duty, fear, or sheer stubborn determination. James Carter had been with Easy Company for 7 months, transferred in after the brutal fighting in France, where he had earned his combat infantryman badge during a week of nearly continuous contact with enemy forces. At 23 years old, he was one of only 12 black soldiers integrated into the predominantly white regiment, part of a military experiment that remained controversial even as the conflict drew toward its conclusion, even as political leaders spoke publicly about democracy and freedom while maintaining racial segregation in the very forces fighting for those ideals. Staff Sergeant William Morrison gathered his squad of 9 men near a half-destroyed barn at 0600 hours, the structure's remaining walls offering minimal shelter from the cold wind that carried the smell of turned earth and distant smoke. The objective was straightforward in the way military objectives often appear on maps. Advance 2 kilometers northeast toward a series of farmhouses intelligence suggested were lightly defended, possibly abandoned, probably not worth the resources required for a full assault. Secure the area, hold until the main force caught up, then continue the push toward objectives deeper into territory that mapmakers were having difficulty keeping current as the front lines shifted almost daily. Morrison was a career soldier from Kentucky, 31 years old, with a thick mustache that he kept carefully trimmed and a reputation for bringing his men home alive, for making the hard calls that kept casualties low, even if it sometimes meant objectives took longer to achieve. He spread the map across the hood of a battered Jeep, its olive-drab paint chipped and scarred from weeks of hard use. Then Morrison said, his finger tracing the route with the confidence of someone who had read hundreds of tactical maps, "We move in 2 fire teams. Hendricks, you take point with Patterson, Kowalski, and Sullivan. Carter, you're with me, along with Davis, Rodriguez, and Murphy. Standard leapfrog advance. First team moves, second team covers. We stay spread out, stay alert, and we do this by the book." Carter nodded silently, his face carefully neutral. He had learned months ago that speaking up unnecessarily only drew unwanted attention, that quiet competence was the safest path through the minefield of squad dynamics, where some men questioned your presence with every glance, every subtle exclusion from conversations that stopped when you approached. The other men checked their equipment with the ritualistic thoroughness of soldiers who understood that forgotten details could mean death. 8-shot M1 Garand rifles cleaned and oiled despite the mud. Grenades clipped to webbing with pins checked for tension. Canteens filled that morning from a liberated well that hopefully hadn't been poisoned by retreating defenders. The temperature hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to numb fingers, but not cold enough to require the heavy coats that would restrict movement. The sky was a colorless gray that promised rain, the kind of weather that reduced visibility and made air support unlikely. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder, the sound so constant that soldiers had learned to distinguish between friendly outgoing fire and enemy incoming rounds by subtle differences in pitch and rhythm. Private Eddie Sullivan, a 19-year-old from Boston with red hair and a spray of freckles across his nose, shouldered his rifle and muttered just loud enough for Carter to hear, but quiet enough to maintain deniability. "Hope we don't need to rely on anybody running when things get hot." The comment hung in the cold air, ugly and familiar. Corporal Mike Hendricks shot Sullivan a warning glance, but said nothing, unwilling to create division before a patrol, but also unwilling to let the comment pass completely unchallenged. The tension wasn't new, wasn't surprising, wasn't even particularly intense by the standards of what Carter had experienced. He had felt it since joining Easy Company, the careful distance some men maintained as if proximity might contaminate them, the way conversations sometimes stopped when he approached as if his presence reminded them of uncomfortable truths they preferred not to acknowledge, the doubts that lived in sideways glances and uncomfortable silences, and occasional comments that pretended to be jokes but carried sharper edges beneath the humor. He had proven himself competent in minor skirmishes, had followed orders precisely, had maintained his equipment to standard, had done everything the manual required, but he had never been tested in sustained combat, never faced the kind of moment that separates soldiers from heroes in the minds of men who measure worth by blood spilled and ground taken, who needed to see someone break before they would accept them as unbroken. The squad moved out at 0630, picking their way through muddy fields dotted with the debris of retreat. Abandoned equipment too heavy to carry, shell casings that glinted dully in the weak sunlight like scattered coins. Once a burned-out vehicle that had been pushed off the road by engineers clearing paths for advancing columns. The landscape rolled gently, offering little cover between patches of woodland, forcing the squad to move carefully and use every fold in the ground. Morrison kept them moving at a steady pace, eyes constantly scanning for threats, reading the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had survived months of combat by paying attention to details that less experienced soldiers might miss. By 0815, they had covered half the distance without incident, without contact, without any indication that enemy forces remained in the area. The farmhouses emerged from the morning haze, a cluster of 4 buildings arranged around a central courtyard in the traditional style of German agricultural architecture. From 300 meters, everything appeared quiet, appeared abandoned, appeared safe. No movement visible through the windows, no smoke rising from chimneys, no signs of occupation or defensive preparation. Morrison raised his fist, signaling a halt, and the squad took cover in a shallow depression that offered concealment, but not real cover, a distinction every combat soldier understood in their bones. Then Morrison said quietly, his voice barely carrying to the nearest men, "Doesn't feel right. Too quiet. Intelligence said light resistance, but this feels empty. Could be they pulled out yesterday. Could be they're waiting for us to get closer." Corporal Hendricks crawled forward to get a better view through his binoculars, moving with the careful slowness of someone who understood that sudden movement drew eyes and eyes drew fire. The buildings were typical of the region, stone construction that would stop small arms fire, steep pitched roofs designed to shed snow, small windows that limited interior light, but also limited fields of fire for defenders. Hedgerows and stone walls created natural defensive positions throughout the area, offering cover and concealment that could hide entire squads. After 2 minutes of careful observation, scanning windows and doorways and likely positions, Hendricks crawled back to Morrison's position. Hendricks reported in a low voice, choosing his words carefully. "Can't see any activity, Sarge. No movement, no reflections from glass or metal, no shadows that shouldn't be there. Could be empty. Could be they're buttoned up tight, waiting for us to get closer. Hard to tell from this distance. Morrison considered their options with the weight of responsibility that comes with command, with the knowledge that his decisions could mean life or death for the men under his authority. Artillery support was available but would take 20 minutes to coordinate, and command wanted prisoners for intelligence purposes if possible, wanted information about unit dispositions and defensive plans and morale conditions that could only come from captured soldiers willing to talk. Their full withdrawal would mean reporting failure to secure the objective, would raise questions about why they hadn't pressed harder, would potentially delay the overall advance. The textbook approach was reconnaissance by fire, shoot at likely positions and see what shoots back, use ammunition to purchase information. Then Morrison said, making his decision with the calm certainty that soldiers respected even when they privately questioned the wisdom. We'll advance in bounds. First team moves to that stone wall at 100 meters. We provide covering fire. If they draw contact, we know what we're dealing with. If not, we leapfrog and continue the approach, standard procedure, by the book. The plan was sound, reflected standard infantry tactics that had served them well throughout the campaign, that had been refined through years of combat experience and codified in training manuals that every soldier had memorized. What none of them knew, what intelligence had failed to identify, what aerial reconnaissance had missed due to careful camouflage, was that the farmhouses concealed not a token rearguard, but a reinforced defensive position. 5 carefully camouflaged machine gun nests manned by 37 German soldiers who had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this kind of approach, who had registered fields of fire and established overlapping sectors and prepared fallback positions. At 0835, Hendricks led his fire team forward, moving quickly with heads low, spreading out to present scattered targets that would be harder to engage effectively. They moved with the practiced coordination of men who had trained together, who understood their roles, who trusted each other to maintain spacing and provide mutual support. Morrison's team prepared to provide covering fire if needed, settling into positions that offered good fields of view toward the farmhouses. Carter settled into position, his rifle aimed toward the buildings, finger resting alongside the trigger guard in the safe position until a target presented itself. The distance closed steadily. 200 meters, 150, 100. The ground between covering teams shrinking with each second. The German machine gunners held their discipline with the patience of professionals, waiting for the perfect moment when both American teams would be caught in the open, when the maximum number of targets would be exposed, when the devastating surprise of coordinated fire would create the shock and confusion that turns organized assaults into chaotic retreats. Their commander, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, a veteran of campaigns from Poland to France to the Eastern Front, watched through a carefully concealed observation post, his binoculars focused on the advancing Americans. Richter was 38 years old, a professional soldier who had joined the army before the conflict began, who understood that the conflict was lost, but remained committed to making the enemy pay for every meter of ground, to defending positions with the same dedication he had shown when victory seemed possible. He had positioned his 5 MG-42 machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the approach to the farmhouses into a killing zone that would catch advancing soldiers in crossfire that left nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, nowhere to survive except through withdrawal. Hendricks and his team reached the stone wall and took cover, pressing themselves against the ancient stones that had stood for generations and would outlast this conflict and countless others. Still nothing. No fire, no movement, no indication of enemy presence. Morrison signaled for his team to advance, and they rose from the depression and moved forward, maintaining spacing, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. Carter felt his heart pounding in his chest, but kept his breathing steady, controlled, using a technique his father had taught him years ago during hunting trips in the Virginia woods, when they would wait motionless for deer to approach, controlling breath and heartbeat to remain invisible. The memories felt impossibly distant now, separated from this moment by an ocean and a lifetime of experiences that had aged him beyond his 23 years. that had shown him things his father could never have imagined when teaching his son to shoot rabbits for the dinner table. They had covered 30 meters, were committed to the advance with no immediate cover available when Richter gave the order with a single word that unleashed hell. The afternoon exploded into violence with the distinctive sound of German machine guns, that terrible rapid hammering that soldiers learned to recognize instantly, a rate of fire so rapid it sounded like fabric tearing, like the world itself being ripped apart. The MG-42 could fire up to 1,500 rounds per minute, 3 times the rate of American machine guns, and the effect was devastating, overwhelming, designed to break formations and shatter morale through sheer volume of fire. Dirt erupted in geysers around Morrison's team as bullets stitched patterns across the ground, creating fountains of earth that showered soldiers with debris and the terrible knowledge that they were caught in a prepared ambush. The air filled with the whine of ricochets and the snap of rounds passing inches from exposed flesh, sounds that would haunt dreams for decades, sounds that marked the dividing line between before and after. Then Morrison shouted above the noise, his voice carrying the authority of command even in chaos. Fall back to the depression." The retreat happened in chaos that training could only partially organize, in the terrible confusion of men trying to move, while bullets searched for them, while the world narrowed to the next piece of cover and the desperate mathematics of survival. Private Rodriguez went down immediately, hit in the leg, his cry of pain lost in the overwhelming noise. Murphy grabbed him without hesitation, half dragging, half carrying the wounded man backward, with strength born of desperation and the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. Carter provided covering fire, squeezing off shots toward the muzzle flashes, knowing the suppression was largely symbolic against fortified positions, but doing it anyway because training and instinct demanded action, demanded resistance, demanded that you fight back, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Davis sprinted in a zigzag pattern, bullets tracking his movement like invisible predators hunting prey, finding cover behind a slight rise in the ground that offered protection measured in inches, but inches that meant the difference between life and death. Hendricks' team, pinned down at the stone wall by 3 machine guns that had them zeroed with intersecting fields of fire, began returning fire with careful, controlled shots, knowing that ammunition conservation mattered, knowing that panic emptied magazines without effect. The sound was overwhelming, impossible to process. The rapid hammering of German guns like industrial machinery turned to murder. The slower crack of American rifles like individual voices shouting into a hurricane. The shouts of men coordinating movement under fire with words reduced to essential fragments. Carter made it back to the depression, breathing hard, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, the chemical response that lets humans do impossible things. Morrison arrived seconds later, his face grim with the knowledge that his plan had failed catastrophically, that intelligence had been wrong, that men were now paying for miscalculations made by people who weren't in the killing zone. Then Morrison said urgently, grabbing for the radio, "We need to pull back to the tree line. We're in the open here. Hendricks, can you move?" Static crackled from the radio before Hendricks' voice came through, strained but controlled. "Negative, Sarge. We move from this wall. We're exposed to 3 guns minimum. Need smoke or suppression or we're finished." The tactical situation had collapsed into the kind of nightmare scenario that tactical manuals describe. But that feels different when you're living it, when the diagrams become reality, and the reality is bleeding men and impossible choices. Rodriguez was bleeding through Murphy's hasty bandage, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide with pain and fear. Murphy worked frantically, while Davis provided what cover he could with precise shots toward positions he could barely see. Morrison grabbed the radio to call for artillery support, but before he could transmit coordinates, a 4th machine gun position opened up, this one from their flank positioned exactly where retreating forces would naturally move. Richter had held one position in reserve specifically for this moment, to cut off the obvious line of retreat, to create a trap that caught soldiers between positions with no safe direction to move. Bullets snapped through the air above the depression, creating that distinctive crack that happens when rounds pass close enough to create shock waves you can feel. One found Private Davis, catching him in the shoulder and spinning him around with the impact's force, dropping him hard into the mud where he gasped in pain and shock. Now they had 2 wounded, 9 men total, pinned down in an inadequate defensive position with limited ammunition and no clear path to safety or reinforcement. No way forward and no way back, and time running out with every second. Then Morrison said into the radio, his voice tight with stress, "Firebird 3, this is Easy 2, taking heavy fire from prepared positions, at least 4 machine guns, possibly more. Multiple casualties. Request immediate artillery on coordinates to follow." The response came back with crushing disappointment, with the bureaucratic indifference of distant decision-makers who weren't bleeding in the mud. Easy 2, Firebird 3, artillery engaged with priority targets 3 clicks east. Earliest availability 40 minutes. Can you hold? 40 minutes. Morrison looked at his wounded men, at the exposed position that offered concealment but not protection, at the ammunition situation that meant they couldn't sustain prolonged defensive fire. Hendricks and his team were trapped at the stone wall with 3 guns preventing movement. His own team was taking flanking fire from a 4th position. In 40 minutes they could all be casualties or prisoners, could be dead or captured or worse. He made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the decision that seemed rational in the moment, but would feel like betrayal forever after. Then Morrison said, looking at the 3 able-bodied men remaining with him, Carter, Sullivan, and Murphy, his voice carrying the weight of command, making impossible choices, "We can't hold here. We pull back to the tree line, regroup, wait for artillery. Then we come back with proper support, with overwhelming force. It's the only way to save anyone." Carter stared at him in disbelief, unable to process what he was hearing. "What about Hendricks and his team? They can't move." Morrison's jaw tightened, muscles clenching with tension that had nothing to do with enemy fire. "They're in cover. Stone wall will protect them. They can hold until we get back with support. We stay here, we all die. This is tactical withdrawal, not abandonment." Sullivan was already moving, helping Rodriguez prepare for transport, accepting the order without question. Murphy looked torn but started gathering equipment, following the chain of command even when the commands felt wrong. The machine gun fire continued, relentless and precise, steady fire from professionals who understood their craft. Carter looked toward the stone wall where 4 men were trapped, then back at Morrison, understanding dawning that this was really happening. Then Carter said slowly, each word carefully chosen, "Sarge, we leave them, they'll get flanked. Those guns will reposition. They'll move to get better angles. The wall won't protect them from multiple directions." Morrison grabbed Carter's webbing, his face inches away, breath hot with stress and fear disguised as authority. "That's an order, Private. We fall back now. That's final." What happened next would be debated in official reports and unofficial conversations for years, would be analyzed by historians and questioned by investigators and discussed by soldiers trying to understand how moments of crisis reveal character. Morrison began pulling the wounded men back toward the tree line, 400 meters behind their position, moving as quickly as careful transport allowed. Sullivan and Murphy followed, providing covering fire between movements, following orders because that's what soldiers do even when orders feel wrong. Carter hesitated, every instinct screaming that abandoning Hendricks' team was wrong. That retreat meant death for 4 men who had advanced on orders, who had trusted the plan, who were trapped because the intelligence had been bad and the enemy had been better prepared. The machine gun fire intensified, and Carter made his choice. As Morrison and the others disappeared into the smoke and confusion of the withdrawal, as they moved back toward relative safety, Carter went forward. He moved in short bursts, using every fold in the ground for cover, every slight depression that might stop a bullet or at least make him harder to see. The machine gun fire was directed primarily at Hendricks' position now. The gunners focused on keeping those 4 men pinned, on preventing any attempt to escape or maneuver. Carter worked his way at an angle, moving perpendicular to the main axis of fire, using the Germans' focus on the obvious target to mask his own movement. His mind catalogued what he knew from observation and training. 5 machine gun positions based on the fire pattern, probably 2 men per gun based on standard crew requirements, maybe a few riflemen as security, because professionals don't leave machine guns unprotected. 30 to 40 enemy soldiers in prepared positions versus one man with a rifle, 4 grenades, and a choice that couldn't be unmade. The mathematics of the situation were impossible, the tactical calculation absurd, the rational response clear. Fall back with the others, save yourself, accept that sometimes men die and there's nothing you can do about it. But Carter wasn't thinking about mathematics or tactics or rational responses. He was thinking about Hendricks and Patterson and Kowalski and Sullivan, men who had advanced because Morrison ordered it, who were now trapped because the plan had failed, who would die if someone didn't do something impossible. He was thinking about every doubt, every whispered slur, every moment when someone had questioned whether he belonged in this company, this army, this fight. He was thinking about proving something that shouldn't have needed proving, about demonstrating worth that should have been assumed, about earning through action what others received by birthright. He was thinking that maybe this was the moment that defined everything, that maybe some choices transcend calculation and exist in a realm where courage and desperation and stubborn refusal to abandon brothers become the same thing. Carter reached a hedgerow 30 meters from the nearest machine gun position, close enough to hear voices shouting in German, close enough to smell the distinctive scent of cordite from sustained firing. Through gaps in the vegetation, he could see the gun emplacement, a carefully constructed position with sandbags and timber reinforcement, overhead cover to protect from shrapnel, a 2-man crew working the MG-42 while a 3rd man fed ammunition belts from a metal case. The gun was focused on the stone wall, tracer rounds showing its line of fire every 5th bullet, creating a deadly stream of fire that kept Hendricks' team unable to move, unable to escape. Carter pulled a grenade from his webbing, the weight familiar in his hand, the mechanism simple but requiring precision. He checked the position one more time, calculating angles and distances, estimating the throw required. 4 seconds from pin pull to detonation, 4 seconds during which the grenade would arc through the air visible to anyone looking, 4 seconds that represented the difference between success and catastrophic failure. He needed to get the grenade into or immediately behind the position, close enough that the blast would disable the gun and crew. Miss by too much, and he would simply announce his presence and get cut down by the other positions, would die having accomplished nothing except demonstrating that impossible odds are called impossible for a reason. He pulled the pin with a smooth motion, refined through countless training repetitions, released the spoon that started the fuse burning, counted 1001, 1002 in his head to let the fuse burn down and prevent the defenders from having time to throw it back, and threw with all the strength he could generate from his prone position. The grenade arced through the air in a trajectory Carter couldn't fully track, disappearing over the sandbags into the emplacement. Carter pressed himself flat against the earth as the explosion came, a sharp crack that carried across the battlefield, followed by screams and the sudden silence of the machine gun that had been firing continuously. Before the smoke cleared, while confusion still reigned, Carter was moving, sprinting toward the next position while the other German gunners tried to process what had just happened, tried to understand if this was a single soldier or the vanguard of a larger assault. The second position was 40 meters east, similarly constructed but oriented to cover a different approach angle, positioned so its field of fire overlapped with the now destroyed first position. Carter had the element of surprise for perhaps another 30 seconds before the Germans reorganized, before someone took command and directed fire toward his position. He used a different approach this time, circling to come at the position from behind where the defensive construction was weakest, where sandbags protected against fire from the American positions, but left the rear exposed. 2 men were in the emplacement, both looking toward where the first grenade had exploded, trying to understand the situation, trying to decide if they should reorient their gun or maintain their current field of fire. Carter didn't hesitate, didn't announce himself, didn't give them a chance to react. He raised his rifle and fired twice, working the bolt action smoothly between shots with the muscle memory that comes from thousands of repetitions. Both men went down. He was beside the position in seconds, verifying they were no longer a threat, then turning the heavy machine gun toward the third position. He had never fired an MG-42, had only been on the receiving end of its devastating fire rate, but the basic operation was similar to American guns: trigger, traversing and elevation controls, ammunition feed. He squeezed the trigger and sent a long burst toward the third position, the incredible rate of fire startling even though he had been expecting it, the gun bucking in his grip as rounds poured out at a rate that emptied the belt in seconds. The third position returned fire, but Carter had already abandoned the captured gun, moving again, using the chaos and smoke to mask his movement, understanding that staying in one place meant death. His actions had created confusion in the German defense, had disrupted the careful planning that Richter had invested days implementing. Richter, observing from his command post, was trying to understand what was happening, trying to piece together fragmentary reports into a coherent picture. One position destroyed by grenade, a second captured and fired against them, movement in the smoke and confusion. How many Americans had broken through? Where was the main assault? What kind of unit executes this kind of infiltration? Carter used that confusion like a weapon. He approached the third position from an angle the defenders weren't watching, their attention focused on where Morrison's team had been, where Hendrix's team was pinned, on threats from expected directions. He got within 20 meters before someone spotted him and shouted a warning in German. Carter threw his third grenade without breaking stride, dove for cover as return fire searched for him, bullets snapping through the air close enough to feel, then moved again before the grenade exploded. The blast silenced the third position. 3 down, 2 remaining. But now the German defenders understood they were under attack from their flank, that someone had penetrated their defensive line, and the remaining 2 positions adjusted. Machine gun fire converged on Carter's approximate location, bullets shredding vegetation and chipping stone, creating a storm of lead that made movement seem impossible. Carter found himself taking fire from 2 directions, trapped behind a stone wall that was being steadily chipped apart by sustained fire. Breathing hard, assessing his situation with the cold calculation that comes when death is measuring the distance between you and safety in millimeters. 2 grenades left, 6 rounds in his rifle, 8-round capacity minus 2 expended, 2 machine gun positions that now knew approximately where he was, that had adjusted their fire to trap him. The mathematics remained impossible, but now he was committed, had no path back even if he wanted one. From the stone wall where Hendrix's team sheltered, Corporal Mike Hendrix had watched Carter's assault with growing astonishment that had progressed through disbelief to awe. The first explosion had drawn his attention, the unexpected sound coming from behind the German positions, then the second position going silent, the distinctive sound of an MG-42 firing on German positions. Through the smoke and confusion, he had caught glimpses of movement, recognized Carter's distinctive frame, understood with dawning wonder what was happening. Then Hendrix said to his team, his voice filled with wonder that made him forget the discipline of quiet, "That's Carter. Jesus Christ, that's Carter. One man, he's taking out the guns." Patterson, a farm boy from Iowa who had never hidden his doubts about integrated units, who had made his opinions known in ways both subtle and direct, stared toward where the third position had just exploded. His face showed shock and shame and the beginning of understanding. "He came back for us. Morrison's squad pulled back and he came back." The realization spread through the trapped fire team like electricity. While the rest of the squad had withdrawn to safety, while they had been left pinned and waiting for artillery or capture or death, Carter had advanced, alone, against impossible odds, for them. For men who hadn't always treated him as a brother, who had questioned his courage and his commitment and his place among them. Hendrix made a decision, understanding that this was a moment that would define him as surely as it was defining Carter. When he hits the next position, we move, we get to him, support his assault. Patterson, you're the fastest. When I give the word, you sprint to Carter's position. We'll provide covering fire, keep the remaining guns focused on us. Carter, behind his stone wall with pieces of it being systematically destroyed by machine gun fire, was calculating his next move with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute crisis. The fourth position was 50 meters northeast, the fifth position 60 meters east. Both had him partially exposed if he tried to maneuver, both were pouring fire in his direction. He needed to change the dynamic, force them to react instead of hunting him, create an opportunity where none existed. He took his fourth grenade, the second to last, pulled the pin and threw it not at a position, but into the open ground between them. The explosion created a cloud of smoke and debris, a curtain that briefly obscured visibility, reducing the perfect fields of fire that Richter had so carefully established. In that moment of reduced visibility, in those few seconds when the smoke was thickest, Carter sprinted toward the 4th position, firing his rifle as he ran, squeezing off rounds not for accuracy but for suppression, for the psychological effect of return fire. He emptied his magazine in 6 rapid shots, dropped behind a fallen log, and reloaded with practiced speed, fingers finding pouches and extracting the clip and inserting it without conscious thought. The 4th position's machine gun searched for him, tracer rounds cutting through the smoke like angry red hornets seeking flesh. Carter could hear German voices shouting coordinates, trying to direct fire, trying to predict his movement. He raised up just enough to throw his final grenade, putting everything into the throw to get the distance, knowing this was his last explosive, his last chance to neutralize a position without direct assault. The grenade landed short by 3 meters, but close enough. The explosion showered the position with shrapnel and concussive force. The overpressure in the confined space of the emplacement, devastating even when the shrapnel didn't find flesh. Carter charged, covering the remaining distance in seconds with his rifle up, ready to fire, knowing that hesitation meant death. He found 2 German soldiers stunned by the blast but alive, one reaching for a pistol with shaking hands, the other trying to orient his rifle. Carter fired, worked the bolt with mechanical precision, fired again. The gun went silent, the 4th position neutralized, 4 positions eliminated. 1 remained. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter, in the 5th position, understood that his carefully prepared defense had been dismantled by a single soldier, executing an assault that defied every tactical principle he had been taught in 2 decades of military service. It defied tactical logic, defied the mathematics of combat, defied the basic assumption that prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire could stop infantry assault. But the evidence was irrefutable. 4 positions destroyed or captured, his force reduced by 2/3, and the American advance no longer pinned down. He had 1 machine gun, 4 men, including himself, and a choice: continue fighting against an enemy who had proven capable of impossible things, or withdraw to report what had happened, and to warn others that something new and terrible had emerged from the smoke of battle. Before he could decide, before he could give the order that would save his remaining men, Patterson arrived at Carter's position. The young private from Iowa had sprinted across the open ground while Hendrick's team provided covering fire, had run through machine gun fire because Carter had run through it first, had demonstrated that courage was contagious. He slid into cover beside Carter, his eyes wide with adrenaline and wonder. Then Patterson said, breathlessly, words tumbling over each other, "Carter, the others are coming. Hendrick says we finish this together. Says you've earned the right to lead this assault." Carter, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion, from the chemical come-down after sustained action at maximum intensity, nodded. Moments later, Hendricks, Kowalski, and Sullivan joined them, 4 men who had been trapped and were now free, 4 men who had been left behind and were now fighting beside the man who had refused to abandon them. Hendricks assessed the situation quickly with the tactical eye of an experienced NCO. Then Hendricks said, his voice carrying both respect and determination, "1 gun left, probably low on ammunition after sustained fire. We hit them from 2 sides, no grenades left, so we use overwhelming fire and movement. Carter, you've earned the honor of leading this final assault. You tell us what you need." It was a simple acknowledgement, 3 sentences in the middle of combat, but in that moment it meant everything. Carter had not just proven his courage, he had exceeded any reasonable expectation of valor, had demonstrated something that would be discussed and analyzed and held up as example for generations. He had advanced when others withdrew, fought when he could have fled, and single-handedly neutralized 4 fortified positions against odds that should have been impossible. The final assault took less than 2 minutes but felt longer, time stretching the way it does in combat when every second contains decisions that mean life or death. Carter and Patterson moved from one direction while Hendricks led Kowalski and Sullivan from another angle, creating a crossfire that caught the 5th position between converging forces. Caught in overlapping fields of fire, with no support from the destroyed positions, with ammunition running low after sustained firing, Richter made the only choice that preserved his remaining men's lives. A white cloth appeared above the position, tied to a rifle barrel, the universal symbol of surrender. The German soldiers emerged with hands raised. 4 men who had witnessed something they would discuss in prisoner of war camps with a mixture of respect and disbelief, who had been part of a defense that should have been impregnable, but had been overcome by individual courage of a magnitude they had rarely encountered. Richter, seeing Carter for the first time as a person rather than a target, understanding that his defeat had come not from overwhelming force or superior tactics, but from individual courage of a magnitude that transcended normal human limits, looked at the black soldier who had destroyed his position. Then Richter said in careful English learned from pre-war study, his voice carrying genuine respect, "One man did this? One man destroyed 4 positions?" Hendricks, covering the prisoners with his rifle, while fighting the urge to lower it in the presence of defeated enemies who had fought honorably, answered with pride in his voice that he made no attempt to disguise. "One of the finest soldiers I've ever served with, maybe the finest." By the time Morrison returned with reinforcements 40 minutes later, artillery support that was no longer needed trailing behind him, the farmhouses were secured. The wounded had been given first aid, their bleeding stopped, and pain managed with morphine from aid kits. The prisoners were under guard, disarmed and awaiting transport to processing centers. Easy Company's objective was achieved, the area secured, the advance able to continue. Morrison emerged from the tree line with support that had come too late, with the remaining squad members who had withdrawn, and with the knowledge that his decision to pull back would be part of his official report, would be examined by superiors, would be a weight he carried. He found Carter sitting on a stone wall drinking from a canteen with hands that still trembled slightly, surrounded by the men whose lives he had saved. The scene spoke volumes. 4 men who had been abandoned now clustered around the man who had refused to abandon them, their body language making clear where loyalty had been earned. Morrison approached slowly, his face unreadable, processing what he was seeing, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Then Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying only to Carter, "I need your report, Private." Carter stood, came to attention with the automatic response that training had burned into muscle memory, and delivered a concise tactical summary. Enemy positions identified and neutralized, 4 men recovered from pinned position, 5 prisoners secured, objective achieved, minimal friendly casualties. He spoke in the flat, professional tone of a soldier reporting to a superior officer, giving facts without emotion, describing actions without interpretation. He did not mention abandonment or betrayal, did not mention the choice Morrison had made or the choice he had made in response, did not let personal feelings color professional reporting. Morrison listened to the report, processing the tactical achievement, understanding the implications, knowing that what Carter had done would have consequences that extended far beyond this patrol. Then he did something that surprised everyone present, something that suggested whatever calculations had led to withdrawal were being reconsidered in light of what one man had accomplished. He extended his hand. Then Morrison said, his voice carrying deliberately to every man in the company, making this a public statement rather than private acknowledgement. "I will be recommending you for the highest honor this action merits. What you did today was beyond duty, beyond expectation, beyond anything I've seen in 3 years of combat. You saved lives at tremendous risk to your own, and you did it after." He paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood they would be remembered and repeated. "After I made a tactical decision that left men exposed, you corrected my mistake. That took courage I'm not sure I possess." Carter shook his hand, understanding that this was as close to an apology as military protocol and Morrison's pride would allow, recognizing the significance of a sergeant publicly acknowledging error to a private. "Just did what needed doing, Sergeant, what any soldier should do." But they both knew that wasn't true, that what Carter had done transcended should and entered the realm of extraordinary, that most soldiers in his position would have withdrawn and been justified in doing so. The story of what happened at those farmhouses spread through the regiment within hours, carried by men who had witnessed the aftermath, who had seen the destroyed positions and heard the accounts from Hendricks' team and the German prisoners. Within days, it had spread through the division, growing with each retelling but not requiring exaggeration, because the truth was remarkable enough. The official report documented the action in dry military language designed to convey facts without emotion. Private First Class James H. Carter, demonstrating extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty, single-handedly assaulted and neutralized 5 enemy machine gun positions, enabling the rescue of 4 surrounded soldiers and the capture of 5 enemy combatants. Recommended for Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration. But the unofficial story, the one soldiers told in foxholes and mess tents and in letters home, was about more than tactics and valor. It was about a man who had been doubted by people who should have known better, who had heard the whispers and seen the sideways glances, who had been left behind by his own squad in a moment of crisis, and who responded not with bitterness or anger or justified resentment, but with a heroism so pure it changed everyone who witnessed it, who proved through action what should never have required proving. Private Eddie Sullivan, who had made the crack about running when things got hot, who had questioned Carter's courage with casual cruelty, born of ignorance and prejudice, sought Carter out that evening. They sat together in the growing darkness, neither speaking for several minutes, the silence heavy with things that needed to be said, but were difficult to articulate. Finally, Sullivan found his words, fumbling through an apology that couldn't possibly be adequate, but had to be offered. Then Sullivan said, his voice thick with emotion that he made no attempt to disguise, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about so many things. What you did today, I don't know if I could have done it. Hell, I know I couldn't have done it. I would have stayed with Morrison, told myself I was following orders, and 4 men would be dead because I wasn't brave enough to disobey." Carter looked at the younger man, saw the genuine remorse, the transformation that combat sometimes forces on those who survive it, when survival depends on seeing people clearly rather than through the distorting lens of prejudice. "We all do what we have to do. Tomorrow it might be you making the impossible choice. Might be any of us." Sullivan shook his head emphatically, rejecting the equivalence that Carter offered. "No. What you did was different. You had every reason to let us handle our own problems, had every justification to follow orders and save yourself. But you didn't. Tomorrow, if I'm half the soldier you proved yourself today, I'll count myself lucky." Similar conversations happened throughout the company, men processing what they had witnessed, examining their own assumptions and prejudices in light of Carter's actions. Patterson sought him out to apologize for years of dismissive comments and subtle exclusions. Kowalski, who had never been overtly hostile but had maintained careful distance, extended friendship without reservation. The dynamics that had defined Carter's integration into Easy Company shifted fundamentally, not through lectures or orders, but through demonstrated worth that could not be denied or diminished. The recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross worked its way through military bureaucracy as the conflict entered its final weeks, processed by officers who read the report with growing amazement, who verified details with multiple witnesses, who understood they were documenting something extraordinary. Carter continued serving with Easy Company, participating in the final advances into Germany, present when units from East and West finally met and the division of post-war Europe began taking shape. His action at the farmhouses had changed something fundamental in the company's dynamics, had created a shift that went beyond one man's recognition. Men who had maintained careful distance now sought his opinion on tactical matters, included him fully in the informal bonds that held combat units together, treated him with the respect that should have been offered from the beginning, but had required extraordinary proof. The change wasn't universal. Some prejudices ran too deep for even demonstrated heroism to overcome, but it was significant, measurable, real. Corporal Mike Hendricks became particularly close, the 2 men forming the kind of friendship that transcends backgrounds and circumstances, forged in shared danger and mutual respect, built on the foundation of one man saving another's life, and the other man recognizing the magnitude of that gift. Hendricks wrote to his family in Pennsylvania, describing Carter in terms that made his parents understand that their son had found someone worth believing in, worth defending, worth calling friend without qualification. Then Hendricks wrote in a letter his mother would save for decades, "We talk about heroes like they're something from stories, like they're not real people. But I've served beside a real hero, and what I learned is that heroes are just people who refuse to accept that some things are impossible, who make different choices than the rest of us would make, who somehow find the courage to do what needs doing, even when everything says it can't be done. Carter is that kind of person. He's my friend, and I'm proud to serve beside him." The award ceremony took place in June 1945, after the German surrender had made official what everyone had known for weeks, that the conflict in Europe had ended, that the fighting was over, that those who survived could begin the long process of becoming civilians again. Carter received the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony attended by his company, by officers from division headquarters, by military photographers documenting the occasion for posterity. America's second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism in action, the citation detailing his assault on the 5 positions, the lives saved, the objective secured, the courage demonstrated. General Marcus Hammond, presenting the medal with the weight of someone who understood what combat required and what it cost, spoke about courage under fire and devotion to fellow soldiers, about the ideals that the conflict had been fought to defend, and the men who embodied those ideals through action rather than words. But what Hammond didn't say, what couldn't be said in official ceremonies, even in 1945, was that Carter's action represented something larger than individual heroism, something that transcended tactical achievement. In a military still struggling with integration despite official policies, in a society still grappling with fundamental questions of equality and worth that would take decades more to partially resolve, one man's extraordinary courage had provided irrefutable evidence of what should have been obvious, but somehow required proving. That valor and skill and dedication have nothing to do with the color of a man's skin, that courage emerges from character, not complexion, that the measure of a soldier is what he does when faced with impossible choices, not whether he matches some arbitrary physical characteristic. Years later, decades later, military historians would study the action at the farmhouses as a tactical case study, analyzing how individual initiative can overcome numerical disadvantage, how calculated risk can achieve objectives that conventional approaches cannot, how understanding terrain and exploiting enemy focus can create opportunities where none should exist. The analysis would be taught at military academies, discussed in leadership courses, held up as example of extraordinary individual action. But veterans of Easy Company remembered it differently, would always remember it differently. They remembered the moment when assumptions collapsed like the machine gun positions Carter destroyed, when doubts became admiration, when a man they had questioned became the example against which they measured themselves. Private Rodriguez, recovering from his leg wound in a field hospital where nurses worked to save limbs and lives with resources that seemed inadequate to the task, told the story to anyone who would listen. To other wounded soldiers, to nurses and doctors, to visitors from rear echelon units who had never experienced combat. His version emphasized not just the tactical achievement, but the moral one, the human dimension that statistics and citations couldn't fully capture. A man who had every reason to feel betrayed, who had been left behind by his own squad, who had heard the whispers and seen the doubts, choosing instead to risk everything for brothers in arms who hadn't always treated him as a brother. Then Rodriguez would say, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had been there, who had been saved, "You want to know what courage looks like? Real courage, not the movie version? It looks like Carter going forward when everyone else went back. It looks like one man deciding that saving others matters more than saving himself. That's what I saw, and it changed me." Sergeant Morrison's career continued after the conflict, promotions and assignments, carrying him through the peacetime military and into the next conflict when it came. But he never forgot what happened that April day, never stopped processing the decision he had made and the consequences that flowed from it. In 1953, now a lieutenant colonel with command responsibilities and years of accumulated experience, he authored a training manual on small unit tactics that included Carter's action as a central case study. In the foreword, Morrison wrote something that would become widely quoted in military education, that would be excerpted and discussed and held up as wisdom earned through hard experience. Then Morrison wrote in words that carried the weight of personal knowledge, "Leadership means making decisions under impossible circumstances with incomplete information and stakes measured in lives. Sometimes those decisions are wrong. Sometimes the best plan fails when it encounters reality. What separates good units from great ones is the presence of soldiers who will correct those mistakes regardless of personal cost, who will do what needs doing even when orders suggest otherwise, who understand that following orders and doing what's right are sometimes the same thing and sometimes aren't, and have the courage to know the difference." James H. Carter mustered out of the Army in November 1945, returning to Virginia with his service concluded, his duty fulfilled, his contribution made. The homecoming was quieter than he might have expected, less celebratory than the national mood suggested, because even in victory, the racial realities of America in 1945 meant that black veterans returned to a country that celebrated their service abroad while maintaining segregation at home. He married his longtime sweetheart, Margaret, in a small church ceremony attended by family and friends who had waited years for his safe return. He took a job at a factory producing agricultural equipment, using mechanical skills learned in the service to good purpose, working his way from assembly line to foreman over the course of years through competence and dedication. He rarely spoke about his military service to anyone outside the family, deflecting questions with the quiet modesty common among those who had seen real combat, who understood that talking about it couldn't convey what it had been like, and often only satisfied curiosity that felt somehow inappropriate. His Distinguished Service Cross hung in a simple frame in the hallway of their small house, noticed by visitors but never explained by its recipient unless directly asked, and even then his explanations were brief and factual, stripped of the drama that others would later add when telling the story. In 1968, during the height of civil rights tensions when America was being forced to confront the gap between its professed ideals and lived reality, a journalist researching integrated military units discovered Carter's story buried in military archives. Patricia Thornton, a young woman working for a national magazine, requested an interview. Carter, now 46 years old and a foreman at the factory, with responsibilities for 24 workers and production schedules, initially declined. He had built a quiet life, had no interest in becoming a symbol or example, preferred to let the past remain past. Margaret convinced him otherwise with an argument that he couldn't refute, that sharing his experience might matter to a younger generation facing different battles in different ways, that his story might help people understand something important about courage and character and the costs of prejudice. The interview took place on the porch of his small but well-maintained house, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard where his children had played, where he had built the life that service had been meant to protect. The journalist, well-prepared and respectful, asked about motivation with the directness of someone who had researched the facts and wanted to understand the human dimension. What made him go forward when others went back? What drove a man to assault 5 machine gun positions alone? What convinced him to risk everything for men who hadn't always accepted him? Carter considered the question for a long moment, looking out at the yard, perhaps seeing something other than the present, perhaps remembering mud and smoke and the sound of machine guns before answering. Then Carter said slowly, choosing words with care, "When you're in that moment, you don't think about being a hero or proving anything to anyone. You don't think about making history or winning medals or what people will say later. You think about the men trapped at that wall. You think about Hendricks and Patterson and Kowalski and Sullivan. You think about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. You think about whether you can live with yourself if you walk away." Thornton pressed further with questions that got to the heart of the matter. Didn't he feel abandoned by Morrison's decision to withdraw? Didn't he resent being put in a position where heroism was necessary because leadership had failed? Carter's response was measured, showed the perspective that decades had provided. Morrison was trying to save lives. He made a judgment call under pressure, with incomplete information and stakes he couldn't fully calculate. I made a different call based on the same information, based on what I could see and what I could live with. That's not about right or wrong in any absolute sense. That's about each person deciding what they can live with, what defines them. I couldn't live with leaving them behind. Simple as that. The resulting article appeared in a major national magazine and introduced Carter's story to a wider audience at a moment when America was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about race and equality. Letters arrived from all over the country, boxes full of correspondence that had to be sorted and answered. Veterans sharing their own experiences of integration and discrimination, young people asking for advice on how to fight injustice, historians requesting additional details for research projects, strangers expressing gratitude or sharing how the story had affected them. Carter answered them all with the same humble grace that characterized his approach to life. That had defined his response to the farmhouses. That seemed integral to who he was. Several of his former squad members reached out after seeing the article, men he hadn't spoken to in more than 2 decades, finding his address and writing letters that expressed things they hadn't been able to say in 1945. Hendricks, now running a hardware store in Pennsylvania, with a family and responsibilities that kept him busy, visited for a weekend in 1969. The 2 men spent hours talking about everything and nothing, sometimes about their shared experiences, but more often about the ordinary concerns of middle-aged fathers and husbands, children's education and mortgages, and the way the world was changing in ways both hopeful and concerning. On the last evening of the visit, sitting on that same porch where the interview had taken place, Hendricks brought up something he had wanted to say for 24 years, but had never found the right moment or right words to express. Then Hendricks said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude that time hadn't diminished, "I never properly thanked you for what you did. You saved my life, Patterson's, Kowalski's, Sullivan's. You did it when you had been left behind, when you had every reason in the world not to risk yourself for us. I want you to know that changed me, changed how I see things, changed how I try to live, made me better." Carter smiled, the expression both warm and tinged with the sadness of memories that couldn't be fully shared with those who hadn't been there, that existed in a space between people no matter how close. You would have done the same if situations were reversed. Hendricks shook his head firmly, rejecting the equivalence that Carter always tried to create. "I don't know that I would have. I want to believe I would have, but I can't be certain. That's the honest truth I've had to live with. What you did was beyond what we ask of soldiers, beyond what we should ask of anyone. And you did it, carrying a burden the rest of us didn't have to carry, proving things that shouldn't have needed proving." The acknowledgement hung in the air between them, the reality that Carter had faced not just enemy fire, but the additional weight of representing his race, of proving himself in ways white soldiers never had to consider, of earning through extraordinary action what others received by default. That his heroism had been necessary not just to save lives, but to earn the basic respect that should have been granted without question. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.